Welcome back from the break. We're going to finish up this part of the chapter of chapter 16. So when we're thinking about communities, there are particular issues that can really influence overall community structure. So one of those things is what's called top-down control. And basically what this is that grazers or predators can limit the growth of lower trophic levels. And so in this case, you see a shark and it's eating fish, big fish, and then the big fish are eating little fish, and then the little fish are eating plankton. And so at each of these levels, there can be top-down control. And if you change the numbers of organisms at a different trophic level, then you can influence the productivity of lower trophic levels. And you can not just change the productivity of those lower trophic levels, but you can reduce the biomass, overall biomass. This is a little different than bottom-up influences, where if you grow more green stuff to eat, then you can support more primary consumers, and then those primary consumers can support more secondary consumers and things like that. So both top-down and bottom-up influences in communities can change them. But which process prevails can depend on a variety of factors. And so the time of year, the location, changes to environmental conditions can all influence whether a community or an ecosystem is primarily influenced by top-down or bottom-up factors. And they have vastly different influences or outcomes. And so we're going to talk about what happens at each trophic level in the next slide. And you can think about this before we get there. What happens as you increase a top predator? What happens to the lower trophic levels? Maybe sketch out what you think might happen versus what happens if you increase the bottom. At the bottom, you increase primary production. So you increase the grass in a system that organisms are allowed to eat. Maybe think about those things. Okay, so here we have two systems with primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. And what happens from the bottom up compared to what happens if you increase things from the top down. So if we increase things from the bottom up, we get what's called trophic propagation. So if you increase the amount of food, you can increase the number of consumers at all of the trophic levels. And so this is called trophic propagation. Now, this is very different from a top-down effect. So if you increase the tertiary consumers, you might think, oh, if propagation, everything goes up. If you increase something at the top, everything will go down. But that's not the case. And so this is called a trophic cascade. So if you increase the tertiary consumers, then you apply pressure on the secondary consumers, and they go down. But the decrease in secondary consumers actually causes a kind of alleviates pressure on the primary consumers, so their populations go up. And because their populations go up, then the populations of primary consumers go down. So this flip-flopping arrows that you see at the different trophic levels is called a trophic cascade. So it's more like a bouncy waterfall than a straight up or down propagation. And these trophic cascades can be better understood now that you understand something about direct and indirect interactions. And so you have this alternating influence of a top-down predator because you have these direct interactions. You have predation from the top to the next, and from the bottom, the middle to the next. So you have predation happening at every level, but there's this indirect effect of the top predator actually causing an increase in primary producers. In this case, you can see a sea otter is a top predator, and they eat sea urchins. So if you have healthy sea otter populations, you actually have fewer sea urchins. Sea urchins are very voracious predators of kelp forests. And so when you have healthy sea otters, you actually have really healthy kelp forests. If you don't have sea otters, then the urchins eat up all the kelp, and you have very little kelp in the near shore. So what's cool is this research, is kind of based on old classic studies, but here is a study from this year. The lead author is Ashkan Famipur, and he has been working on omnivory. And so if you're an omnivore, we've kind of ignored omnivores in this discussion so far, but this recent paper in the journal Ecosphere talks about how omnivores can cause trophic cascades too. And this paper is really mathematically complicated. If you want to take a look at it, it has lots of really cool modeling. And so maybe by the end of this quarter, this paper will make more sense. I think that's what my little note there was supposed to say. I must have cut something off, so I apologize, but feel free to find this paper and dig in a little bit deeper. Okay, so a few more factors about species that can influence the overall community structure and how the ecosystems work. We can kind of think about the traits of different species. So some species they make up a huge part of the habitat, or they create the habitat for other organisms to live. And these are called foundation species. So the example I gave with kelp forests are a huge habitat for hundreds of species of marine organisms. And without kelp forests, then you lose all of those organisms. So the kelp themselves are the foundation upon which the community is built. And we can think about that similarly for riparian trees. So here we have cottonwood forests, and they are foundation species. You only find certain organisms in riparian habitats, and without the riparian forest, without the tree, then you don't have those communities. And another example might be eastern hemlock, which was a foundation species on the East Coast until this woolly adelgid, which is an invasive insect, started decimating the hemlock. And in this case, that we've really lost that entire habitat, the hemlock subforest. And so the foundation species has vanished, and that's causing some major changes in eastern forests. So foundation species are a little different than what are called keystone species. Keystone species are often top predators, and they have an overwhelming role on the overall community, and partly because their loss or their presence can influence these trophic cascades, but also because they can influence the foundation species, so like the sea otters. Sea stars have an overwhelming influence in nearshore habitat because they're such voracious predators, and they can keep things like mussels in check. And so when there are sea stars present, then the entire community shifts. Organisms like prairie dogs, because of the way that they build these massive cities and tunnel through the ground, they can transport seeds and they turn over the soil. And then sapsuckers, because of the way that they tunnel into wood and create habitat for other organisms, can also be considered keystone species. So what you see there is a picture of Robert Payne, who was a scientist at the University of Washington, and he did some of the earliest work on trying to identify these keystone species around the sea star case study. So here's a picture of what happens when you have sea stars present in the habitat. You end up having all of these other organisms, but if you don't have the keystone predator present, then species richness drops to like 2 or 3 organisms, and all you're left with is a community basically of mussels. And then the last kind of special type of species is called an ecosystem engineer. And in a sense, these 3 types of species, there's some fuzzy overlap. So I like to think of an engineer as an organism that's not like structuring, or that their body doesn't make the habitat like a foundation species, but they themselves build something that creates habitat. And so beaver are a good example of an ecosystem engineer. Their dam building creates new habitat in the ponds and the wetlands that are created around the dams. Galling insects create new habitat in and on plants by changing, the chemistry, basically using chemical signals to have the plant build some kind of structure for their young, which then often is habitat for other insects as well. And so these would be ecosystem engineers. They can transform habitats, or they can create habitats on and in other structures or other species to basically alter communities. So here you can see how much dam habitat we've lost because we've lost beavers. in Minnesota, but then over time, how these beaver are coming back from being hunted to near extinction. So in the 1940s, there were very few beaver dam in this part of Minnesota, but over time, you can see the numbers of dams have really increased. And so this is all new habitat that's really important. So, so those are three types of species that are overwhelmingly influential in communities, and that kind of goes against what I'm going to talk about next, which is this idea that some species are redundant. And this may or may not be true. It's kind of an idea that was proposed by Stephen Hubble I think in the 80s or early 90s. Basically, his argument was that that as long as you had something green and you had something that would eat the green stuff and then something that would eat that organism, you have a functioning system, and that's all you really need. And he called this the neutral theory of ecology, but it's gotten a lot of kickback, it kind of lit a fire under ecologists to try to understand, well, what is the value of diversity, and are species truly redundant, or are they not? And so what we've kind of come around to is this idea that, well, we don't really understand the niche that every species plays, and they might be playing similar roles in some ways as other species, but then they might have completely other roles that they're playing in the community that we don't even understand. So it's good for communities to have some redundancy, to have similar species playing similar roles. This redundancy leads to stability, both in the face of disaster, in terms of like resilience or having an insurance policy or a diverse stock portfolio, but it also can change the way ecosystems function. And so about 25 years ago, scientists got really excited about trying to understand how biodiversity influences ecosystem function. And hundreds and hundreds of studies have been proving how important species diversity really is, and how important diversity at all of the levels we've been talking about in this lecture and the previous one are genetic diversity and functional diversity and regional kind of landscape level diversity. So there's a lot of really cool research out there on how diversity influences ecosystem functions. And over the next few weeks, we'll talk about these different functions. Basically, this is where I've kind of put a lot of my time and effort as a scientist. And so these are just some of the papers that I've been lucky enough to collaborate on and to work with others to study how both species diversity influences ecosystem function, but how also genetic variation and genetic diversity can influence ecosystem function. Lots of studies on land, lots of studies in streams, influences of diversity in terms of riparian tree diversity mainly, but also how diversity then leads to functional diversity. And so I'm happy to talk to you all about any of these kinds of papers that might be interesting to you. And that's about it. So I'm going to wrap this up, and I'll talk to you next week.